So before we get into our philosophical discussions for today, I thought that we should introduce ourselves. My name is Hayden.
Uh,
I recently just graduated with a degree in history with a minor in philosophy, and I am going to be pursuing a master's degree in military history. What the thesis topic is about, still figuring that out. But that's kind of my background. I always kind of enjoyed reading different philosophical ideas and how it applied to uh, historical leaders, kind of like what philosophical ideas they aspired to, how it influenced their policies, as well as like military tacticians and generals. That's like its own whole set of philosophical ideas in and of itself.
yeah, my name is Mark. My background is mostly cybersecurity, programming, definitely not, liberal arts or philosophy or anything, but I do also have a minor in philosophy. Um, my philosophical background is primarily in applied ethics, so talking about philosophical topics, determining what is ethical, what is not ethical, applying that to whatever it ends up being, classic trolley problem, stuff like that is really what I've focused on.
Well, what kind of led you to wanting to go for that minor? Because I mean, I feel like a minor in philosophy for a software engineer or cybersecurity major is a little unorthodox. I think.
Yeah, just a bit. I definitely had a few like weird looks from people because it's very out there. But a couple things I'd taken for my associate's degree. I'd taken a class that included like a small section on programming ethics, because something like self-driving cars had just been a thing, like Waymo and stuff like that, just popping up, and there was and have been people killed or severely injured by a self-driving car. So there's been a lot of discussion on like who does the blame lie on when that something like that happens, and it was very interesting. I also took a bioethics class, and that was also extremely interesting. Hearing different views on the topic and having a good constructed actual debate that isn't just like stuff you see on the internet, where it's a lot of name calling and ad hominem attacks. So from that point, I just kind of continued that, focusing on applied ethics and written a couple papers and like to keep debating and discussing some stuff.
Well, that's something that we do definitely plan on doing here. The reason that I wanted to start this podcast and have you as my co-host is that there are so many place parts in society in the world that we just disagree on inherently. Not like me and you disagree on, but like people will disagree on inherently because we come from different backgrounds, from different ideals, that we subscribe to, and a lot of the times people can't lo look across the aisle and kinda understand where someone else may be coming from. Granted, there's some of them it's valid where it's just it comes from a place of hate, it comes from, a place of bigotry. But other times, it's because someone believes something differently. It's a philosophical idea that they subscribe to, whether it's Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Marx, John Smith. It's something that they just believe in differently, and I believe that people need to understand where other people are coming from, and this is something a place where we're able to do that in a safe environment. Eventually, I would like to have philosophical debates on controversial topics, but the twist is for us how we would do that is instead of each of us picking our own side, our sides will be chosen at random so that our biases won't shine through in that. And I think that that'd be a good thing eventually. Let's be a little way down the line. But yeah, we just want y'all to have a space to hear different philosophical ideologies, different philosophical thoughts, have your opinions about it and have a safe place to do it because, there's very few places where it's safe to speak your own mind apparently in this world, and that's kind of scary.
It's really important. It's super easy to like think of the other and, find ways to demonize somebody based on what they really it's super easy to fall into echo chambers, especially on social media and um, having philosophical discussions can easily and should lead broader and like depth conversations about that stuff where we aren't coming from a place of hate and aggression, but like curiosity and like a eagerness to like learn about what other people
Yeah,
why
for
other people
sure.
think the way they think.
That's important. That's important. You know, because back in the day, our politicians they would reach across the aisle and shake hands. They would compromise on bills and what they wanted for the country. And nowadays, it feels like that's quickly going away, and that's scary.
Yeah,
When our politicians can't put aside their differences um, to make things better for their people. That's a scary world to live in. But to kind of give y'all a roadmap of where we're going to be going, before we can talk about ethics, before we can talk about philosophical economics, tactical philosophy, all that stuff. We're gonna start at the basics. We're gonna go start with how did philosophical thought come about? Who were the major philosophers that kind of started those thoughts, and how that grew into what we know today as the field of philosophy. And that's going to take place over the next several weeks to maybe a month, hopefully. And after that, we're going to take a deep dive into philosophical ethics.
gotta first explain stuff, make sure we have a basis of understanding of, this is what this person arguing the perspective on something. So, once we actually do get to the point of having those debates, we're not just like arguing semantics the entire time because nobody wants to hear that.
Right. I mean, I think the biggest factor in a debate is mutual understanding of definitions. Because if you're just arguing semantics, then you're not going to get anything done. That's just the facts. You're not going to get anything done. So without further ado, let's discuss. So the first thing to understand is, okay, where did philosophical thought come from? Who were the first philosophers? How did that occur? Well, we can thank philosophical thought and most other careers, really, like doctors, like lawyers, pretty much anything that wasn't a farmer or a hunter. We can thank that to the agricultural revolution that occurred like roughly like 10,000 BC. That's the big thing we got to thank there, because that revolution is what allowed permanent settlements to become a thing. Because for the longest time, humanity, Homo sapiens, the prevailing theory is that we arose out of North Africa and spread across the continents. There was a section of us that pulled off and crossed the Bering Strait ice land bridge that connected what is now Russia and the United States, Alaska, and that's what became the Native American tribes, the Central American tribes that will become the Aztecs, the Inca, the Maya, and then once the Ice Age ended, they were cut off from the rest of civilization. From not I want to say civilization, but they were cut off from the rest of humanity, and they were able to develop isolated from the rest of the world. Which that's kind of why um, you know by the time the Spanish got there, they were still using spears, stone technology, and the Europeans, the China, the Asiatic countries at the time, and all they were using gunpowder. As a consequence of being connected, of that part of the world being connected to the Silk Road and stuff like that. So the one of the first kind of texts that we know of where there was some kind of like philosophical thought uh, behind it was Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code, as the name suggests, was developed by a king known as Hammurabi of Mesopotamia, and this is where we get the eye for an eye kind of mantra from, right? So it was very much this was the law of Mesopotamia of, and for reference, King Hammurabi ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE. Um, and these codes were inscribed on big stone tablets, and they were everywhere in every Mesopotamian city. Because you gotta understand, this is one of the first major empires, right? And so they needed their own set of rules that everyone had to follow. Because before this, it was city states, like how the ancient Greeks would be, and each city state had their own rules, what was legal, what was illegal, and and they had different punishments for the same crimes. So that made it hard for, like, say came from another town, committed a crime in that town. Okay, well then is he being tried in that by that town's laws or the town that he came from's laws? Usually, it would be the town that he came from. But then, from that point of view, if the punishment is harsher, then say, "Hey, that's unjust, man. I come from a place where, oh, I get I get stoned for stealing in this town, but in my town, they cut off a finger." So, Hammurabi pretty much said, "Okay, we're gonna have kind of a baseline of what everything's gonna be," and so a lot of it has to do with kind of it's almost like he kind of like said, "Okay, you can have revenge for whatever happened, but you're only allowed this much revenge."
Yeah.
So, for example, this is probably, I think, one of the harsher laws that he established, and by today's days, it would be considered really unethical if a man were to, I believe it went, if a man were to kill another man's daughter, married or unmarried, the the victim's father would be allowed to kill the daughter of the man of the perpetrator, right? And and so, like, for them, it was considered fair because, okay, well, they both lost a daughter. Well, is that truly fair when we examine it in today's standards? I wouldn't consider it so, right? Because instead of the person who committed the crime being punished, that person's daughter is being punished.
Yeah.
And while it would be painful for any father, I would hope, to lose a daughter. Uh, for the person who perpetrated the crime to not be directly punished, I think is probably one of the bigger uh problems with Hammurabi's code. And because it was so, like, okay, an eye for an eye, it made to it made it easier to police and regulate punishments and all that, but at the same time, it just wasn't ethical for the time.
I think there's definitely like some lasting impacts of a code like that because it is spread since then, and it's kind of a well-known thing, even if people don't know where it came from. Like blood feuds are a good example of how detrimental and how overly punishing it can be. So blood feud, you're unaware if something happens, so somebody dies, right? Use that same example, they would basically have to repay that in the same manner. So get in a car accident and kill somebody, right? Then okay, that family is of the person who died has to go kill somebody of the perpetrator's family. And what it can end up doing is just causing a whole lot of unnecessary stress, and it ends up being a punishment that hangs over somebody's head and can get really, really messy. Like people don't leave their house. It becomes a thing where the lineage, like the rest of the family, is now at threat. So it ends up being almost a war instead of it being an actual punishment for committing a crime. It just becomes almost torture.
Yeah, and so that was kind of like the basis, one of the first, like, major sets of laws that we have in our historical record. We but but to summarize, the importance for the agricultural revolution is that it allowed for other jobs to be created, right? Because when you have a hunter gatherer society, your job, if historically, if you were a man, you were a hunter. Your job was to go out and poke the big woolly mammoth, take it down, and that was going to be your tribe, your clan's dinner, lunch, breakfast, whatever, for as long as that mammoth fed you. For women, which actually I think this is something I found out in a high school history project, not history project, high school science fair project. One of my prevailing theories for different for the rate at which men and women can perceive color. I theorized one of the articles that I found theorized that women were better at seeing color as a result of their gatherer past, right? Because one of the things you have to notice as a gatherer was, okay, when is a fruit or a plant ripe enough to pick? Is how okay, oh, I can look at this and go, oh, okay, it needs like a week long or something like that. And so, you know, when you're in a hunter gatherer society, you're stuck in those jobs. The whole point of a hunter gatherer society, the whole purpose is just to survive. That is your job, is just to survive. Whereas when you have an agricultural society, like we see in Mesopotamia, it allows for other jobs to be created. It means that there's going to be a class of farmers and pickers and all that. There's going to be soldiers. They can be early lawyers. It allows like practice of medicine to occur as well.
Yeah.
Those are the benefits of the agricultural society, that's why when we get further and further along in the history after the agricultural revolution is when we really see philosophers kind of take shape. One of the first major of these would be the Greek philosopher known as Thales of Miletus. He these are philosophers. The list of philosophers we're going to be going through right now. This is going to be pre-Socratic, so this is going to be 6th to 5th century BC. For anyone wondering, I use BC and AD in reference to timelines because for one, I am Catholic, so it pays homage to my Catholic roots, as the Catholics were some of the first groups to really prioritize education and established universities, as well as the Gregorian calendar is what started the use of BC and AD, and that's the calendar we use currently. So I do it out of respect for the Gregorian calendar what we use today, as well as my Catholic upbringing. That's me personally.
Yeah.
So Thales of Miletus lived from 624 to 546 BC. He's considered one of the first philosophers in Western tradition, right? So this podcast is mainly going to be focused on Western philosophy. This is where our practices were both where we kind of practice our philosophical thoughts and ideas was in the Western tradition. Eventually, we will move on to Eastern philosophical ideas, Sun Tzu, Confucius, and all that. That's just going to happen later. Um, so to understand early philosophy, you didn't really have like the talks about ethics, the talks about um, capitalism, communism, and all that yet, obviously, because it didn't happen yet. But rather, you had is more abstract than that. It was, what is life? What makes up the universe? And so Thales, his big idea was that water is the fundamental substance, that everything was made of water, right? So to understand, when we go back this far, we got to understand that these men, because these were mostly men, we won't see female philosophers, prominent female philosophers, till about I think the 17th or 18th century. Maybe even I think actually no, it would be
The 17th thing
maybe even the 20th. I think it's like the 20th, maybe the 18th. But
have
anyways,
a couple early ones
these
from the
were
20.
yeah these men were They were lawyers, they were philosophers, they were scientists, they were educators, they were everything wrapped up in one, right? There was no split between philosophy and science at this point in time,
Yeah.
right? Because they didn't have the technology to, kind of test their theories. So, like I said, so Thales' big idea: water. Water is what made up the universe. Is the fundamental element of the universe. It's what everything is made up of. And now in the modern day, we do know that the human body is made up of 70% water. Those of you that don't know, we know that because of experiments the Japanese conducted during World War II, where they deprived prisoners of war for with of water. They deprived them of water for a prolonged period of time. Before the experiment, they weighed them, and after the duration of the experiment, they weighed them, and their weight dropped by 70%. This is where we get the 70% statistic for this. It's pretty dark, but so all
Science
life,
has been done for a long time. Very,
yes,
very dark
yeah,
experiments.
very dark experiments. But yeah, so that's kind of where we get the idea of the 70% of our body made up of water. By that logic, everything is made up of water. Plants need water to survive. We need water to survive. Um, and that's where we also get like the symbology of water being life too, is kind of where we get this idea from. But also it's the truth, right? You can't go, I think it's more than 3 days without water or you die.
It's
I
not
think
long.
you
Uh,
cannot go long without water. Oh, sorry, did I cut you off?
no, I was just saying that. Yeah, I think it's about 3 days. It's not that long. I do have a kind of a comment on this. A lot of their like it's interesting to see kind of how science has changed because um, a lot of people don't really give philosophy a whole lot of credit when it comes to a scientific field, but philosophy is are in a large part what started a lot of scientific thought and
Right.
that sort of process of discovering things. Because a lot of it, like what you're talking about, is you know hey, we need water, right? There's fish in water, animals
Right.
need water, plants need water, and it leads to some of that discovery. So um, it's cool that philosophy can kind of cover not only just more human subjects that we kind of see later, right? Stuff like ethics or um, theology, right? Like that sort of stuff goes into more non-concrete, less concrete ideals, but it's see how it started with the search for knowledge.
Right. Yeah. No. And the sad thing is, when people do look back at our ancestors and all that, they think of them as stupider, as more primitive. As of 10,000 BC, the human mind has not evolved that much. Our ancestors had the same capabilities of thought that we do right now. They were just limited by technology. That's the big difference there. They were limited by technology and by what they could do. So these men, they had these grand ideas. So Thales had the idea that everything's made up of water. He's not wrong, just that he was born in the wrong time to test that.
It's also important to not write off kind of the the teachings or the theories that these individuals had just because they're not scientifically accurate. Um, Obviously, we know that like a rock isn't made out of water, but it could rather be used to show the importance of discovery, importance of striving to learn things and putting out these theories. And it's very easy to look back at a lot of this stuff and go like you were saying, like, oh, that's obviously ridiculous. They're stupid because of, they don't have the tools to understand something. But if you think about it, that's kind of all humans at some point. Yeah, we have access to technology, right? I mean, we're both living in America. We have access to a lot of technology. We have access to the internet that has pretty much every single different piece of human knowledge on it. But some people don't. Right? It's important to just remember that, hey, this is just because if somebody doesn't know something, doesn't necessarily mean they're stupid. It might mean that they had no ability to learn that, or they had something else preventing them from having access to information.
right. So, but yeah, so I mean, everyone has the capability for that. I think that's one of the major takeaways from this point of the discussion. So yes, Thales, his whole theory was, the idea of the water was the universal substance of the sorry, the original substance of the universe. That's where everything was made up of. After this would have been uh Anaximander. Anaximander. Um, he was a student of Thales. Yeah, remember these philosophers were both scientists and educators. Their job was pretty much everything. Um, so his student was Anaximander. He he didn't like Thales's interpretation of the universe. He did not think that water was the source of all things. So that was kind of his big rejection. Instead, he subscribed to the idea or he came up with the idea of the Empyrean, or the boundless or infinite is the source of all things. So like, um, he's just that the origin of the universe had to be infinite. It can't be defined. So he called it the Empyrean. Um, and this kind of came as a result of like we can never understand how the universe is created. It's unfathomable the creation of the universe, which is kind of crazy to think about, given now how in today's day and age, we know about the Big Bang.
Yeah.
We know we know how that arose, which crazy enough, it was a Catholic priest. It was a Catholic priest trying to prove the existence of God by proving the existence of the universe was, an action of God. How do you do this? Well, his whole theory was that when God said, "Let there be light," there was an explosion and everything was created in the universe. Well, if you were to look in a telescope and like the Hubble telescope, or what's the other one? There's another telescope that's up in orbit. And you use those big super telescopes and look really far. You're essentially looking to the past of the universe, and there's a
Yeah.
whole section where you can't see nothing because it's so full of radiation. It's blinding light. That is the remnants of the Big Bang,
Yeah.
and so that was kind of where that kind of idea started. And that kind of does disprove Anaximander's point a little bit, right? We Because it disproves it because we know the start of the universe, we know what makes up the universe, but at the same time, we don't know what started the Big Bang, right?
Yes.
Because you have this whole counter theory of I think it's called the Big Crunch or whatever, or like
Yes.
so like the universe explodes in the Big Bang, right, and then it comes back as like the Big Crunch where everything's crushed up in a tiny ball,
The
and then
theory
it explodes.
Yeah, the theory is
Oh,
pretty much that the universe is constantly expanding and compressing. So that's why it's the crunch. It's essentially just like in a breathing motion, right? So instead of being like the Big Bang was like the start of the galaxy or the universe, and that was the first time and the only time, right? It's just that it is a continued cycle. And that right now what we're seeing of the universe is constantly expanding actually is just the expansion before the compression, basically.
right, right. So, I mean, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that idea. Like, I feel like it's an interesting hypothesis because then it really does, make you question. Okay, well, if the universe is always expanding, if the universe is always it's just expanding and crushing, like you know, like like if someone's breathing, right? And then it's like, okay, well, then what's the point of life? What's the point of living if everything is just going to, you know, if we're just going to get crushed?
Yeah, it's
Which I'm sorry.
you're good. It's definitely like an interesting thing, but I feel like that existentialism that a lot of people have with that aren't necessarily like the best thing to be dreadful about because realistically, yeah, if that does happen, you can't do anything to control it. And even though you can have that very like existentialist view on it, there's always something to do. You can always enjoy your time while you're here, and um, does not mean you have to, you know, view it as such a bad thing. Right?
Right, no, yeah, I agree. You know, because I do feel like that it's one of those things where you there's only so many things you can control. Worry about what you can control.
Yeah,
I think that's the thing, the big message. Just figure out what you can control, and that's it. Worry about what you can control. Yeah. So that's Anaximander. His whole idea was, oh well, what if it's everything, everything and nothing created the universe? It was indefinite. We
yeah,
will never know. And while, not really scientific, right? You can't really test that there's nothing. It does really make you think about how, early societies viewed the universe.
yeah, yeah,
And
definitely.
then so yeah. So after Anaximander comes Heraclitus of Ephesus. Um this is kind of where we get the whole idea of logos or logic from.
Yeah,
Um, so he lived from 535 to 475 BC. He was most famous for his doctrine of perpetual change. Uh, this summarized, by a famous statement of his. It says, "You cannot step into the same river twice." And we kind of get that. That idea kind of makes sense. So for example, I live near the Mississippi. If I were to step into the Mississippi, get out before the currents swept me away, because I don't live up north where it's just a little tiny little stream. I live where the currents are. So if I were to get out before the currents swept me and then got back in, it's not the same, because it's not the same water that's traveling by. It's water that's come all the way up from, I think it's what, it's Minnesota. That's where the Mississippi River starts. A little bit up in Minnesota.
yeah. I think it's blue area. If it's up in Minnesota.
Yeah. So yeah. So his he has there's definitely logic behind that reasoning. And so he believed that the universe was always in a state of flux. There was always change, a perpetual change that always occurred in the universe,
Yeah,
governed by what he called logos, which is where we get, logic from. That's the Greek word, the Greek root of logic. It's a rational principle that organizes and guides all things. So everything has a purpose. There's something that always causes something else.
yeah,
So he believed that the fundamental forces like hot and cold, life and death, they were really important for the universe to remain in balance, right?
yeah,
So he definitely wouldn't be in favor of a necromancer just raising the dead. He's like, no, that's bad. Don't do
yeah.
that. Don't do that. Um, but yeah, so I think this is kind of where we get, when you have logic classes in college, which funnily enough, I did not take a logic class. Thank God I did not. Those are a pain, because you have to write logistical formulas, and those are a pain. I don't think Heraclitus knew what he was coming up with when he came up with the idea of logos.
See, now, I personally love logic as a programmer. Um, Discrete mathematics, which does have like logic and their stuff, and honestly, my favorite math class. Love that. Um, so I'm the exact opposite. I think it's great.
It's good for when you have a background in like code and like write something in a different language. When you do not, like I took Latin. Latin and a logic class are two completely different things, man.
Yeah,
Two completely different things. Because you're not like writing out a different word, you're writing out a symbol for something else, and then you have to make it all make sense using symbols. It's like you're writing hieroglyphs.
it's fun.
It's, we'll disagree on that.
Yes, we will.
We will. Um, yeah, so Heraclitus, I think, is definitely one of the major pre-Socratic influences. You know, he's I think there's that trinity of ideas, right? You have logos, you have pathos, and then I always forget the third one: logos, pathos,
Yes.
ethos. Well, yeah. So he was the founder of the idea of one of those big three.
Yeah.
So to to kind of prove Heraclitus's point, uh, Parmenides is the of Elea. He lived from 515 to 450 BC. He was like the foil to Heraclitus. He was the opposite.
Yeah.
He he would argue that change is nothing but an illusion. That reality is a single, unchanging, eternal being. He argued that the senses deceive us into believing in the change, but that true knowledge came from reason. So that you could only know yourself, your existence, or rather, you reveal the oneness of existence through reason, right? So this is kind of like the start of metaphysics in philosophical thought. This is kind of the guy who started that. So Parmenides' work, he definitely emphasized metaphysical speculation, and he laid that foundation for what would eventually become metaphysics. And I think metaphysics is definitely interesting. I think out of all the philosophical, ideologies, it's definitely the most hippie of them all because it's still trying to solve the age old question of what is existence, what is life. It's definitely something that you would come home to your dorm and hypothetically your roommate is high off of marijuana, and he goes, "Dude, what if we're all potatoes?" That is metaphysics. That is metaphysics in a nutshell.
In a very, very extremely simplified way, but yeah.
I mean that's what a nutshell is, though. A nutshell is a very, very simplified form of something. So, so right. Um. Okay. So then, we get to someone that I think all of us know, some of us love, some of us dread. Pythagoras of Samos. He lived from 570 to 495. He is best known for his mathematical contributions. If he sounds familiar to you, probably because he does. Have you ever heard of the Pythagorean theorem? That's where he comes from. This guy, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you ever were annoyed by that equation, you can blame this guy. Um, but he, as a mathematician does, holds numbers in high regard. He believed that math would give us everything. It would solve the problems of the universe. Um,
Boo.
what do you mean, boo, dude? This is like your stuff. You love math.
I do. I like math. I like logic. However, I don't like geometry. The only math I ever liked was discrete math, which is stupid because I feel like it's the exact opposite of what everybody likes. But
I kind of enjoyed geometry because it took like a whole new different like approach to math, if that makes sense. It's like instead of you're just solving for an abstract equation, it's like, okay, now you're solving for a purpose. Figure out how big this freaking circle is,
yeah,
or figure out the triangle. Like, it gave a purpose to the math. Personally, that's how I saw it, and I kind of enjoyed that. And I never found Pythagoras's theorem to be too complicated. I thought it was rather simple.
it is. I
You know, but
like
but
most
yeah,
people.
but also aside from math and numbers, he did believe in a harmonious order to the universe, which was explained through mathematical relationships.
Yeah.
His whole idea, and then later on in his life, he had the ideas of the soul, reincarnation, and the importance of like being remaining morally pure would influence later religious and philosophical thought. Well, so dude kind of had his hands full, bro. Had his hands in everything
Yeah, just
a little bit. After which we have uh, Empedocles. Empedocles lived from 490, 430 BC. Dude definitely would have been a fan of the Avatar series. Because he believed that, and I mean, I do mean the Last Airbender, not the blue people.
Oh,
Because
I
he
thought you meant the
believed,
blue people.
nah, bro, the goat, bro, no, bro, the goated TV series that shouldn't have been made into live action. Yeah, that's my hot take. The live action was doo doo. The only thing good about it was Iroh, and that was about it. And even then, Iroh was okay. But anyways, that's beside the point.
Yes,
So, Empedocles, his whole idea was the four cosmic elements that made up the universe,
yeah,
and those elements being earth, wind, or air, fire, and water. Yeah, so dude was definitely an inspiration for Avatar.
definitely.
Um, and then he had the idea of two opposing forces, those being love and strife. Uh, so the so by the basis of these two elements or these two opposing forces, these his whole idea was, oh, these forces, excuse me, these forces can never unite or separate. Um, and these kind of explain the creation of the cosmos, that life and existence is the feud between love and strife.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think Bro is a hopeless romantic. Um, I I I've really never read up on him that much, so I don't know enough about him to give an opinion on that.
I don't either.
All I would say is, like I said, I think Bro is just a hopeless romantic.
Probably, aren't we all? But
Aren't we all? I'm so lonely. Okay. All right. So, next up we have Anaxagoras. Um, his whole dealio was the role of Nous, Nous, or the mind, in organizing the cosmos. So he saw the mind, or Nous, as the thing that brings order to the universe. He argued that everything in the world contains a portion of something else,
yeah,
that um and that the mind, or the nous, organizes and arranges that into distinct forms. Which, to me, okay, this kind of sounds like early onset evolution theory a little bit, right? Because we have the whole idea like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of everything in everyone, and I think it's like we share like 70% of our DNA with bananas.
yeah.
I think that's the statistic.
Just
Like seven.
such a crazy statistic.
I know, dude. Like, imagine looking at a banana and go, "Damn, I'm 70% related to you." That's
23andMe,
crazy.
but it determines what type of banana you are.
But also, fun fact: we don't have natural bananas anymore. They're all artificially, the brand, not the brand, the breed of bananas we have now is completely man made.
Yeah.
We have lost the OG banana because plagues.
I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that the like quote unquote artificial banana flavor that people find in
Dude,
like Laffy
that's
Taffy
the
is like the
OG,
real
that's the
taste of it.
OG, that's the OG banana
Yeah,
flavor, bro. Imagine biting into a banana and it tastes like the banana Laffy
I'd
Taffy.
actually eat bananas then.
Dude, actually, yeah, no, low key, hot take number, I think, three now we're on.
I've
Uh,
lost count. I usually
banana Laffy Taffy is the best Laffy Taffy.
100%.
100%. Uh, yeah, so his whole thing was that the mind brings order to it all, which I think there's a little bit of sincerity in that, because the mind does kind of help us organize our thoughts and all that. Though I would this definitely, as someone who lives in the 21st century, disagree with that. The mind creates the form, like our physical forms, because that's based on DNA and all that. And again, that's something that we know today as a result of modern science and technology, right? So not knocking him as a philosopher, but rather that his philosophy became outdated once modern science was able to catch up to it. All right. Um. So okay, so this dude, the ancient Greeks definitely thought he was like smoking crack. Right. We have Democritus.
Opium.
Well, okay. Oh, for the time, opium. Definitely opium. He was definitely on the opium train. Uh, this dude, Democritus, lived from 460 to 370 BCE. His whole thing was that he's like, dude, what if there are atoms? This dude, this dude lived between the the fifth and fourth century BC. Straight up was like, man, what if we are made of tiny particles called atoms? Straight up, like, dude thought it before anybody, right? And unfortunately, as a result, of the science at the time, he couldn't test that theory. So everyone just looked at him as a freaking nut job, right?
Rolling in his
So that
grave, just like, I'm right, I'm right.
exactly, man, exactly. And what's funny is that he's kind of right, right? So like, he has this idea of the atom, right? He can't prove it,
Yeah,
and then his version of the atom moves around through a void, which combine in different ways to create the objects that we perceive.
yeah,
Which in a way is right because atoms they they kind of move around. They're so small that it technically is like a little bit of a void. But the opposite, it takes a lot of energy for atoms to unite to fuse together. Hence why we haven't been able to create uh atomic fusion or be able to recreate it except for like fractions of seconds. Like it's like very difficult. If we do crack it, holy hell, we are in for a treat.
yeah.
Just gotta hope we don't vaporize the Earth when we do it.
50-50.
50/50
If
chance. I
anything,
like
we'll
the
just
thought.
make another demon core or something.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. We'll make another elephant's foot.
Hopefully not. That one, not the best.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so Democritus is considered one of the last. Is like considered the last like major pre-Socratic philosophers. How are we on time?
Oh,
How are we
we're
on
chilling,
time?
dude.
How much time do we got?
We were in
How
an
much time?
hour, but we spent like the first 10 minutes or something, or like 20 minutes not really talking. So yeah, we're fine.
So we got an hour. We're at an hour right now.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. We still got about at least another hour at most. All right. So now, we are going to be talking about Socrates. Yeah,
The
Socrates.
man,
That's one of the big names. The
the
man,
legend.
the myth, the legend, Socrates. So definitely Socrates definitely marked the first major shift in philosophical thought, right? He is considered to be one of the fathers of Western philosophy, uh, because so all the philosophers we talked about before this would be considered what we call natural philosophers. Their thoughts, discussing, the natural world, the nature of life itself, all that. That those are what we call natural philosophers. Socrates would question ethics, human behavior,
Yeah.
and the nature of knowledge. Like, what is knowledge? Um, and then unlike, however, to differentiate himself from the others, the pre-Socratic philosophers. Unfortunately, Socrates did not leave any written works. He literally just talked off the cuff.
Yeah.
So that's one of the shames of that. Um, but eventually, his one of his students, Plato, would write about his teacher Socrates, and that's kind of how we have our knowledge about Socrates and his theories and all that.
Yeah.
Um, so his major contributions to philosophical thought would have been, the ideas of ethics, and then
Yeah.
as well as the Socratic method, which the Socratic method is a form of dialogue in which you involves asking a series of probing questions to stimulate critical thinking and illuminating ideas. Socrates believed that wisdom comes from recognizing one's own ignorance, right? So
Yeah.
recognizing where you struggle, where you falter in terms of your knowledge. That's one of the core parts of gaining wisdom,
Yeah.
right? Because if you can recognize your flaws, you can better them. So
Yeah. Socrates is great. A lot of, I mean, Plato is was a very large part of my kind of background and education on philosophy with nature of knowledge. We actually know anything. Um, we do know things. How do we know that they're right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. Um,
right.
very interesting stuff. So I think Socrates is probably like one of, if not the most well-known philosopher, I'd
Oh,
say.
I like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, like the big three that almost everyone recognizes, and that's not unjustly, right? They contributed so much to the field
Yeah,
that they shaped Western philosophy to what it is.
absolutely.
Um, and the Socratic method is probably one of the best methods to teach. I mean, uh, it definitely it allows you to think. It allows you a space to think and come to your own conclusions instead of you're just parroting what your teacher says,
Yeah,
which I think is one of the bigger issues with American education systems, how the colleges work, is that at some point you literally just become a parrot of your professors.
yeah. So if your professors are wrong, you're wrong, and it just is a continued cycle, really.
Yeah, right. So yeah, however, I think where Socrates does falter is his um his theory on ethics and what makes you ethical. He believed that you are more ethical if you have more knowledge. The more knowledge you have, the more ethical you are. Which, while there's a point to be made there, right? If you have more knowledge on a subject, it definitely allows you to be more illuminated by those topics, right? So, like, um, you know, if you were to say, you know, learn about um, you know, domestic violence rates, right? You would become more knowledgeable on that, and thus you would be more ethical, right? You would know the statistics, you would know, the rates at which domestic violence could occur and all that, and you'll be able to know the signs, right? And that would be ethical because you're able to point that out, and if you are able to prevent domestic violence, that is ethical, right? However, where this kind of falters is like say military commanders, right? If a military commander is more knowledgeable, what's he going to be more knowledgeable on? He's going to be more knowledgeable on tactics and strategy. And while those tactics and strategies might, save the lives of his men, right? He's only prioritizing the lives of his men. He's not trying to prioritize, at least this time, he's not trying to prioritize life overall and say, oh, we want limited casualties as much as possible. He's gonna kill them the most efficiently. That's just the fact.
I
Yeah.
I think like it's the thing that he misses is like kind of this an idea of like having like just a baseline like as like a thing what is ethical or what is not ethical, right? Like
Right.
um do we have like just a baseline understanding of ethics? Need to be knowledgeable to have ethics, or do you need to be taught it, or is it something just like ingrained as a human that you have, right? So that idea he definitely misses on, which is an interesting idea to kind of wrestle with because it can get a little complicated. Like does a baby can a baby act ethically or unethically because of like, well, can somebody who doesn't know, like an infant, be unethical? Um, is it based on like physical restrictions? Like obviously a baby is not able to go crime. Or is it based on like, are we taught, right? So
Right. I yeah, no, that definitely goes into the conversation of nature versus nurture. I yeah, that's really
my
interesting.
metaphor kind of sucked, but um, it what in us allows us to be ethical? That's the really big question that I think Socrates or reading it, they're like the reactionary responses. What
Right.
is?
Yeah, I think that's one of the fundamental questions that I think we do need to ask, right? I think part of it has to do with, us as a society. We definitely do not uh we do not value violence, at least in today's day and age. We do not value violence. You so our ethics, our philosophy on that is like, oh, if you push someone, you hurt someone, yeah, that's bad, that's unethical. Right. And I think, a part of that is innate when we're born. I think part of it is, right? So when you're born, right, you're innocent. You really kind of don't know how the world works that much, but you know certain things, right?
Yeah,
Like when, it's like when I was little and I would push a kid, whether it was on accident or not, and the kid fell on their butt and started crying, there was a sinking feeling in my stomach. I'm like, oh no, I did something wrong, right?
yeah,
Even if someone didn't inherently say, hey, Hayden, don't be a don't be a dummy and push kids around,
yeah.
right? There's still something there that tells us, hey, this is wrong.
Mm,
And I think that is, both a knowledge and a curse when it comes to the human experience, right? Because, in terms of like it depends on your occupation, right? So I think depending on the time period, it could be a curse to be like, oh man, to wrestle with this in terms of like, say your city's besieged, right? And you're trying to protect your people, but you have to go push around the bad guys, all that stuff. Which, granted, you can just wrestle with that and be like, these are bad guys. Let's bomb them, not bomb them, but attack back.
yeah,
In the case of a besieged city, you're not gonna have air raid sirens and all that. You're gonna deal with ballistas and trebuchets and all that, which even then, that's not what they would have. They had like I don't even think they would have any like what we would consider artillery pieces back then. I think all they would have had would have been like although they had the Trojan horse, they had the let's see, they had hoplites, you know, so it was definitely more hand to hand combat focus. Anyways, we're getting off track here. Yeah, so apologies, but yeah, so Socrates definitely is one of the most important figures that we will discuss. Also, I think something important to note is that he did say one of his famous quotes is that the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that definitely has some basis.
yeah,
You know, if you live your life and you never reflect, like I mean, obviously you don't have to keep a journal, right? You don't have to keep a journal about oh dear diary, I did this today. But if you don't live your life and you talk to yourself and be like, okay, did I do that right? You know, like for example, I had to do some reflection after I graduated this past spring about what I wanted to do with my life. Granted, ended up deciding that I wanted to pursue military history, but I didn't know I didn't know that at the time when I
yeah,
graduated. I was grappling between, oh, do I want to be a lawyer or do I want to be a historian? Oh, what do I want to do with my life? And I'm glad that I took the time to reflect instead of rushing head on into something, right? Because if I'd have made the choice, for money reasons, right, I would have gone straight for law school, and I probably would be unhappy. Like I would be successful. I would argue. I don't think I would struggle in law school, but I would be unhappy because while law school, I'm kind of interested in law and all that. My main love, my main interest is history, and always will be history.
Yeah.
And so, like, to deprave myself of working in fields where I'll be able to talk with people that have my same interests and, be able to, bounce ideas about, like, I can't live a life without that.
Yeah.
That's something that's been formally, like, ingrained in me that I and so that's something that I think is really important. And so, always look inward and say to yourself, "Is this worth it? Is what I'm doing worth it?" It never be too scared to ask yourself those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I kind of want to use the movie Wall-E as of like the unexamined life is not great. Like if you're just kind of living and not really thinking, kind of just become like an amorphous blob of a human, right? Like, having that introspection and wanting to better yourself or wanting to do whatever is really what makes life special in a way, right? Like,
Right.
um, instead of just kind of having the monotony of like life, you have something more exciting. It's very easy to just get like bogged down by like an adult in society having a job and you work and then you go home and just kind of living like that can suck. But some of that introspection and thinking and deep thought and can keep life interesting. It can keep the monotony away a bit. Sense.
Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely you can never be sure about anything in life. You can never be sure. If you wake up the next day, you'll never be sure if you make you, that. I was gonna say that was something about your turn. I was about to say, but wake up the next day or make it to tomorrow. But you'll never know what's in store for you.
Yeah.
So always just look at yourself and say, "Is this the best thing for me?" And if it's not, don't be afraid to walk away. Never be afraid to walk away because when you're sure about something, you'll know, you'll feel it. It don't take something just because it's there. Take it because you know that's what you want. And I think that's what I think that Socrates definitely preach as well today.
Yeah.
Um, and then uh something that we see in Christian theology and philosophical thought, it also comes about in Socrates as well. Socrates in his ethical thoughts believed that living a virtuous life, however, for him, a virtuous life would be a life of thinking, a life of gaining knowledge. That's to him what a virtuous life would be. But a virtuous life would lead to happiness. And
Yeah.
we see that in Christian theology. And I think that this is one of the things that while he looks at it from a different way, it's still true,
Yeah. I mean,
right? Yeah.
it allows it to be changed based on the person, right? So what that looks like, what exactly that looks like, depends obviously for him. That it was education, but it can be whatever you.
Right. Right.
Even though I do think that kind of raises some issues of like is letting somebody because like what somebody could be a virtuous life would be like instead of gaining knowledge, it's being addicted to substance, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that it's based on a different each person's different definition of virtuous. There's definitely a concrete objective definition of virtuous. Just
That's
that
fair.
Socrates' version was rather instead of living like a pious life, instead of living, your life for Christ, which, if you were theoretically, if you truly lived your life close to Christ, then you wouldn't be tempted to sin. You'd still sin, right? But you wouldn't be tempted to sin overtly and all that stuff. You would live a somewhat virtuous life. Whereas with Socrates, it was just if you were gaining knowledge, that is the ultimate virtue in life is knowledge. So if you live that, you're gonna be happy.
Yeah.
So I think it's just two different definitions of virtuous. I think the modern definition still would work, right? Because I think doing good by others, I think should make you feel happy. I mean, if it doesn't, I think it sounds like a you problem personally. Like, man, if you don't like giving Jimmy, like little Timmy from the orphanage, like soup,
Probably something wrong with you.
what's wrong with you, man? Give Timmy his soup. Timmy wants a soup. That told to me once. Gamer soup. Oh god. That just got me thinking of
That's not good.
yeah, isn't there like something called like gamer soups?
Yeah, actual thing.
Oh god. Oh god, no, no. Philosophical ramen. No. Anyways,
Be spicy.
um, that would be spicy.
Probably.
Yeah. All right. So the next one I would consider Socrates one of my favorites, but definitely Plato
Yes.
is definitely one of my favorite
Oh,
philosophers. How are we on time?
we're
I
good.
definitely want to aim for like okay, okay. I want to aim kind of for an hour and a half
Well,
or
honestly,
more.
we could probably finish the Play-Doh.
Here's for Plato. So the last person we're going to talk about today, Plato, lived from 427 to 347 BC. I said BCE. Uh, BC. I'm not cringe. I don't use before Common Era or Common Era. Those are cringe timestamps. I will die on that hill. For Common Era and Common Era sounds so basic, and like I get it. It's a way of doing it that's not. I always forget the word for this. Jesus, why can't I think of the word? It's like when you're not so religious. It starts with I think it starts with an S.
Agnostic?
No, no, no. It starts with an
Like
S. I think.
secular?
Secular, yeah. It's a more secularized version of you know of AD BC and all that. So I understand it, but I think it's great. Anyways, Plato, that he was one of the major students of Socrates. Uh, he would, unlike uh, the cringe students of the past that disagree with their teachers about everything. Plato actually liked his teachers' thoughts and ideas and wanted to expand on them. That was his big thing, was expanding on what Plato or what Socrates had thought, and even possibly even improving upon it. So his one of his big contributions to philosophy would have been uh, metaphysics, epistemology, and political theory are his big realms.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of metaphysics, uh, he uh, he helped establish, or he didn't help, but he established the theory of forms, and it's just kind of like a again one of those things where like your roommate would just start talking about this, and you're like, dude, what are you talking about? You are high. Shut up. Anyways, Plato's theory of forms is definitely considered one of his more significant contributions, but he argued that the physical world is nothing but a poor reflection of a higher immaterial reality. He argued that nothing is really real, but what we perceive is imperfect versions of what the forms or ideas are. So everything is a form. Everything has a form, which is the perfect version of it. It's the ideal version of it.
Yeah.
Um, that these are unchanging entities that exist independent from the physical world. And then everything that exists is nothing but a imperfection of the form. So one of the big examples is, like, oh, what's a dog, right? When we think of a dog, we think of an animal with four legs, right? Animal with four legs, the canine, um, man's best friend, right? But a dog can have three legs, right? A dog can have
Yeah.
three legs. It can survive with three legs, but that's not the perfect dog, but it's still a dog, right? So that's kind of the theory of forms, is that everything exists, but they're not perfect.
Yeah.
And Plato believed that true knowledge came from trying to understand the forms and not from like your senses. What do you think about that? The theory of
Uh,
forms.
I mean, right? So, I think like the dog example of having like, I don't know, it I don't know. It's trying to like think of what my like way to say what I'm thinking it, but it's like just relatively escaping me. Um, like a lot of I don't even know, struggling.
That's okay, dude. Like theory of forms is definitely like really way out there. It's like, bro,
It's because I don't know. There's so many things like trying to boil something down to like a specific like this is this thing. I just don't really like to do. Um, because there's so many things that are subjective. Like the dog example you're talking about is like um have there a dog has four legs, right? A dog barks, but a dog could have three legs. Like that example leads to the just subjectivism as a like a whole. Like everything is slightly different. It's not like
right,
there's not really like ever a true binary in like in the world. Like you can have a dog that obviously doesn't have three legs or doesn't have four legs, right? Everything can be slightly different, and determining like what is perfect there or like the ideal thing, something is not really easy to do, or I would even argue possible to do when no matter what, everything can be slightly different.
right, right. I see that. I think that's definitely probably one of the big critiques for the theory of forms would be that okay, well, if everything is imperfect, then what is everything? If and I think that in this instance, it's definitely something it's really far out there, right? Because while like you and I, for instance, we believe um that God, He created us from His own image and His own mind. Okay, so then are we perfect in that regard, right? Because at one point we believe we were, the garden, we were perfect, but now we're imperfect. So I think there is some sort of there's some legitimacy to that, but at the
Yeah,
same time, we're born as ourselves, right? And so I think the only perfect thing is to be imperfect, right?
yeah. That's what my
Because
counter argument would is like,
if you're
um,
perfect, there's nothing to improve. And if you're perfect, there's nothing to reflect on. That means you're not examining your own existence. Which kind of goes contradictory to Socrates' own statements.
yeah. I just there's I- like I think like you can kind of make them into what different quotes depending on like really the context and what you're looking at. But like there's the like if everybody's not normal or if everybody's different, nobody's different type of a thing. Um,
Right.
where like you can't really have perfection, and it's also kind of a moving yardstick, like it's a moving goalpost. Perfection can be different to different people. Um, so that in that case, perfection is options, is differences, is imperfection in a way, right? Because no matter what, never going to be the same. Otherwise, perfection is just kind of impossible to have, and that's just I wouldn't necessarily say true.
Right. Yeah. So moving on from the theory of forms, we're going to get to epistemology.
Oh,
Which this is Plato's idea of knowledge as recollection. So Plato believed that learning is just a process of remembering the innate ideas that we are all born with and our soul has forgotten, right? So this kind of falls into again that nature versus nurture argument, right? So he argued that the soul is immortal and possesses knowledge of the forms before being born to the physical world. So that we are born with an innate sense of knowledge in our soul, but when we're born, we forget that knowledge and we have to relearn it, right? Which I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting to look about it that way because you know because we every human has the capacity to learn.
yeah,
I mean, granted, each person has their own difficulties and challenges that they have to overcome it when learning, but everyone has the capacity to learn, right? Um, so when we look at this, and I think there is something to be said about that, that we all have the capacity to learn this knowledge, right? So then that means that, if everyone has the capacity to know that knowledge, that means that everyone has to have that kind of like that same sense of, right, okay, you're relearning, you knew this at one time and you're just relearning.
yeah.
But also, sorry,
No, it's such a like unprovable thing though. Like
Right.
That's and I think that would be kind of like, oh yeah, that proves the theory correct because like um Plato does talk a lot about like you can't really, right? Um seems like he does, right? Like I think the allegory of the cave, like you can very easily just be living in something that don't can't see the quote unquote reality. You just think you know what's going on, but like I could be in the Truman Show right now. There could be a camera, somewhere around my room that is now watching me, and it's going on TV, and people watching it, and they think I'm, interesting for some really odd reason. Um,
Right.
but like it's such a like a weird thing where you can't really like prove that to be true or not, and um, doesn't, in my opinion, the idea of like having all of that knowledge just be like you are kind of born with it, and you just relearn it isn't a good explanation of it because it doesn't. I want to say like it doesn't like properly like explain why like learning things or knowledge as a whole. It just it doesn't really. I don't think it really works to explain knowledge and to explain learning things and whatnot because there's no way to prove it. It's just kind of
Yeah,
a thing.
I see that. It's yeah, right. But so I think where it does have some legitimacy though is definitely in the nature versus nurture argument, right? Like we were talking about,
Yes.
when you're little, you have an idea of some things being right? Like, you shouldn't hit a kid, you shouldn't, know that. Eventually, I think lying is one of the innate things that we'll still do as a child. That's one of the things that you quickly learn if you have like the right role models. But lying is one of those things that you shouldn't do. Lying is wrong.
Yeah, I think like the kind of the point with that is that I think I would agree with the idea that you're kind of born knowledge is if it wasn't made or at least seeming like the argument um all knowledge and rather some knowledge, right? So having going to that
Something
nature
that I
versus
know from
nurture argument,
calculus.
it's not like it's not like I was born with a very, very deep understanding of quantum physics, right? I don't know anything about quantum. I don't think, we're born or like our soul has the knowledge of everything, but rather like we have knowledge that of just kind of reflexes, I'd say, right? Or deep, basic emotions and like ethics. Is that what I'd say, right? Kind of to what your point is. But I, I don't think there's any way to see whether or not it's true. I secretly know, or not secretly, like my soul, I was born, knew everything about didgeridoo playing techniques. Just doesn't really make sense.
Mm. Just because of that, I want to learn how to play the didgeridoo to prove you
You should
wrong.
do it.
Didgeridoo. I didgeridoo will. That sounds so dumb. All right. So the last, the last thing that, um, the last thing that, uh, is contributed to Plato would be, uh, the Republic and philosopher kings. The idea of political philosophy. Um, so in the Republic, Plato described his ideal society, which would be ruled by philosopher kings. This would be the Republic. Um, these would be individuals that possess both wisdom and the ability to govern justly, as he so said. Um, he believed that only those who would understand the forms, especially the form of the good, as he called it, are fit to rule. Right? And I think that there's an inherent problem with this, right? Because you're saying that only the people that know one specific uh, form, something that we cannot perceive, is able to rule.
Yeah. It,
Which I feel that at least in this case, this is something that can be innate in us, but at the same time, it's like, okay, I would argue for a more Machiavellian in this instance, where the time that Plato was living in, for a more Machiavellian inspired ruler versus a Plato inspired ruler, someone who believed in reforms, right? Because a ruler sometimes can't make the good decision. He has to make the best decision for his people. Which, while it can be the best decision for his people, the most moral decision for his people, the most moral decision for everyone. Prioritizing one group of people over the other is going to lead to inherent um, problems, right? So, in terms of like for a Machiavellianist, they're going to try and prioritize keeping their own power above everything else while trying to meet the needs of the people. Which is, I think, why Machiavelli gets such a bad rap. He's not a fascist. He's not a dictator. He's a realist. He's because his big work, The Prince, is a letter to the Medici's who just took over. I believe it was Florence. They just took over Florence. They didn't trust Machiavelli, so they threw him away, made him a political prisoner. And he's like, "Yo, man, I can help. Here's what do I do as a prince and all this stuff."
Yeah.
And you he wasn't saying that you know, oh, a ruler has to do that, but a ruler's morality is different from the commoner's morality. Right? There's more complicated things afoot. So while I think a philosopher king would be a cool idea, I don't think it would be ethical to have a philosopher as a king.
Basically, uh, keeping leadership based off of an understanding of something that, I mean, like common knowledge, right? It's just not a good idea because what if somebody, right, doesn't have the ability to know that, but could also be a good leader, right? There's more that goes into being a leader than being able to understand philosophy, in a sense. Like, obviously, the argument can be made that philosophy allows you to understand everything else about being a leader because you understand philosophy, so transfers. But um, it doesn't 100% track, and the gatekeeping based off that can to whole bunch of division. And in a time frame where not everybody can get an education, it can be very, very discriminatory that position of power, regardless of whether or not they'd actually be able to be good at the job or not.
Right. I think that is definitely one of the glaring issues in that. But also, it's more so about what philosophers are back in the day, back for Plato's time. They were both scientists and thinkers, and philosophical thinkers. These were people that questioned everything. Whereas, while it's good to question everything, a ruler doesn't have the time to question.
Yeah.
A ruler doesn't have the time to ponder all the different ideas, which is why rulers have advisors, that people that are knowledgeable about different things. That's why the president has his cabinet is so that they can advise him on his decision making,
Yeah.
so he's not stuck, trying to go. Oh, I don't know what's going on in Ukraine right now. What should we do? This is when you call in your Ukraine expert and go, man, dude, they just pushed into Russia, and then they go, oh, okay, now what do we do? And then they'll advise them.
It,
So that's one of the important things, that a ruler doesn't have to know everything. They just need to be able to surround themselves with competent people.
right. But I think that in that society, it kind of does either further limit. It's mostly going to be people who just are educated in that sort of sense. So, um,
Right.
right, there's the experts in the fields are kind of the people that you're already, you know, that would already kind of fit the requirement in that sort of sense, if that makes sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, not going to be somebody who's just, yeah, it's going to be more, it's still going to be restrictive, right? Instead of having somebody who's just a good leader because they're a good leader, and then also surrounding themselves with people with knowledge. It would basically be people with knowledge just making a group and then making the decisions for the whole, right? A philosopher might not know the best policies for a farmer
Right.
because they're a scientist, right? a thinker and a doctor, whatever. Very different from that. Um, Having a more collaborative sort of environment where the considerations of people from different backgrounds included, right,
Right.
would be much more beneficial than just a
One.
philosopher in charge,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. Unfortunately, this is where we get to leave it off here. I hope y'all enjoyed us talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers,
Yeah.
Socrates and Plato. Right now, next week, we will be talking about. We'll be continuing where we left off, starting with Aristotle and making our way as far as we can with the major philosophical thinkers that kind of helped shape philosophy to where it is today.